Hello, everyone. Hope you had a chance to take a break, use the restroom, hopefully grab something to eat. So, as promised, what we're going to do now is we're going to have a dedicated, let's give 15 minutes for everyone to refactor their users page to actually try playing around with composition API. Again, okay. I'm going to go ahead and push up the code that I showed earlier so you all have something to look at. But otherwise, have fun with it, and then don't worry, we'll be walking through the solution at the end of this. So I'll see you all in 15 minutes. Great. All right, how did that feel for everyone? I know that we did some pairing here in the room, but people online kind of let me know how that experience went if you have questions. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and start walking through the solution to see how I would approach this. All right, so currently I have my user page open. And actually, let me make sure I'm on the right branch, actually. So 10 solution. Yep, this is great. OK, so we'll go ahead and let's start coding. 574, great. Close. All right. So first thing first is what do we want to do? We want to go ahead and, wait a second. Oh, I left my changes from earlier. I needed to. Sorry about that. OK, let's restart. Recording-wise, this is where the solution is going to start, because I had a test code I was working on earlier already up. OK. OK, so let's go ahead and dive into the code. As we can see here, what we want to do is we want to migrate the stuff we've been doing, especially as far as the fetch stuff, into our setup function. So let's go ahead and start doing that. First thing first, again, I always like to put my setup before data as a reminder to myself that this is not going to actually be able to access anything below it. Right? It can go top down, but there's nothing going bottom up. So let's do a couple things. Let's see. All right. So this method here, async functions, let's start actually by moving the data. The data here, I'm going to go ahead and use the reactive, since that's something that at least feels a little bit more familiar to people. I think when they're first getting started with composition API. So we'll import reactive from view, and we'll create that state, which is going to be a reactive object. And inside of there, I'm going to have this thing called user list, and user list will then be this array. And so this allows me to then get rid of this data property. The only thing we need to do now is actually return the state here. And then to show that this works, what we can do is you can say this.state.userlist. And then if everything should still work, the only thing we need to change is here, state.userlist. And we save that. Let's go and see. If we refresh, it's down because why? Because there's no local dev running. OK. There we go. You can see everything's still working. All right, so refactored, step 1, good to go. Next thing we need to do, the main thing we want to do is this function of methods. And so some of you caught on because you might be thinking, wait, is there like a methods thing that I need to import from Vue? And the answer is no, because when we introduced methods earlier, remember what I said? Methods are really just JavaScript functions that Vue has access to. So in other words, there's nothing special about them because they're JavaScript functions. So what we can do, we can take this, and we can copy this here, and basically say, this is an async function called fetch users. Now, before we move on, though, there's a couple things that's going to break. One, we know for a fact that this does not work anymore. Because why? We're not in Options API. We're in Composition API. So we have this state here that's deleted. And then this is currently state.userlist. We'll equal that. And we have the async here. And so what we need to do is let's go ahead and also we also don't have, or actually, wait, there's the function there. That's fine. And then let's go ahead and start by returning it. We'll slowly refactor this so we can see it step by step, piece by piece. Bum, 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 bum. There's that. Now we save this, though. You'll notice everything seems to still be working, interestingly enough. And so we'll see that hello, hello. And so here's the thing, though, is that right now, fetch users has a very implicit tie to our state right now. In other words, if we wanted to fetch users in another context, we would then need to create another function, theoretically. But this is JavaScript, this is programming. We don't want that. That's something that wouldn't make a lot of sense. And so what you'd probably want to do is actually separate the state assignment here from the function itself. So in other words, what we'd like to do is actually say state.userList out here is equal to what happens when we run fetch users. That's actually what we'd like to do. And so what we'd really want is to basically kind of return the response that comes from this. But if you return it just like this, as we learned actually earlier inside of the classroom here, that this will actually return the promise directly. And
she was rewarded with suffering.
Yeah, just our typical.
Sounds good. OK, so I'll rewind it back to where at least vocally. I think I know where I can go before that. Okay. So when you're looking at this and you're looking at the return, you might think, OK, I'm just going to return the promise. Now, apparently, when it comes to returning promises inside of Vue, it gets a little bit tricky because then you have to manage like resolving the promise and that kind of stuff. And so at least for me, what I tried to do actually is I will actually just create the response that's being awaited. So basically this const response. And what I do is return the response directly. And that's what's being returned, rather than returning the entire promise itself. And that's what should allow this thing to assign itself to this. But before we finish, though, remember that fetch users is an async function, which means what? We need the await keyword here. And if we need the await keyword here, what does that mean? We also need the async key all the way up here inside of setup. And if we save that, we get our predictable yelling at us message. And the reason for that is because why? Because the parent is like, whoa, 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 you have this thing that's doing async function. It might be broken. Give me something to fall back on. So let's go and fix that. If you go inside of app.view, inside of c'est la view, we have this component here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to wrap it in a suspense component. And then we'll have our template with the v slot of fallback. And then what we'll do here is then go data is loading, save. And if you actually saw the small blink, it actually does do the data is loading because Vue actually is waiting for something. So granted, again, for your production level apps, you probably will want some sort of nice loading page and whatnot for that. But for now, we're just doing it with simple text. But now, if we take a look, it looks like everything is working as expected. Now, the thing is, though, we're actually doing a double call here, if you realize it, in that we're returning this fetch users method, but it's actually already being called inside of your setup method. So really, we don't even need this here. So we can actually delete our entire created lifecycle hook. And what you have now here is basically your entire user page using the composition API within the options API, and everything is working as expected, thankfully. Cool. Does anyone have any questions about the solution that I just went through? OK. So let me go ahead and commit this. Feature add solution for user page refactor to composition API. OK. So now that we've done that exercise, it's time to switch back over to our playground. Let me go here. Great. There we go. And CD playground. OK. So we're on to our next section regarding composition API with script setup. All right, so let's context set a bit here. When we take a look at this user page, you'll notice that, well, most of our component is actually in composition API. Like minus the components registration right here, everything else is composition API. And so Vue was certainly, when we were thinking about the developer experience of working with composition API, it was a bit like, well, OK, this is cool, right? We can break stuff up. We can go ahead and write our JavaScript in a way that's kind of more natural for us. We can group it the way we want. But then like, the fact that we have to constantly write our returns gets a little bit tedious, especially when you have a lot of things to return. That's now something you have to manage in two different places, right? You have to define what you're going to do, then you're going to return it. Couldn't Vue be a little bit smarter about this somehow? And so this is where things like build tools are really great, because with Vue 3.2, we introduced a compiler optimization where it allows us to actually fully buy into the composition API while saving us some code space, and more importantly, allowing us to be more succinct and concise. And so let me show you what I mean by that. So let me go ahead and go over to the playground, and let's go into the Pokédex. All right. So the Pokédex, similar to what we had earlier, is basically mostly bought into the composition API. In fact, there's only a couple of things we need to do to fully change it. And so for now, let's see, computed. In fact, this was a made-up thing. So we're going to go ahead and delete computed from here, because we don't need this region name lowercase. And then methods, change region name, again, was something we decided to do just to sort of change things. So we'll go ahead and migrate that, because what are methods? Methods are JavaScript functions. So const change region name equals a function where we say region name. And region name in this particular case is a ref, which means we need to unpack it. And it's going to be hoen. Once we have that, we can return that to our template. And then there we go. And then we don't need to log any of this. So now we should be back in a similar state to what we had earlier when we had the user page. OK, so let me go ahead and actually check out branch 11 begin. There we go. And then we'll check out branch 11 exercise. And let's commit this change real quick. Feature, update Pokedex to be almost fully composition API. OK. So what is script setup? Well, script setup is exactly as it sounds in that what you do is you add an attribute to your script block called setup. And what that does is it tells Vue this entire block is going to be composition API. Like no options will exist in here. So what does that mean? Well, first thing first, there's no more object. That's what options API is all about. It's about defining this object. So export default disappears. Then we can save that. But that's still going to break, which is totally fine, because you know why? We already know that it's in setup. So this line 5, this async setup here, also not necessary. Delete. Save. Better, but here's the other thing. Because we're now in a compiler optimization, meaning Vue can now do a lot more static analysis and those sort of things, we don't even need to return anything either. And believe it or not, this block of code here, in fact, let me just delete the console logs here. This whole thing just works.
You just sold me. I was super skeptical until this moment.
Yeah, this is the mic drop moment for those who are thinking about composition API. This makes a lot of people excited, especially for those on the heavier JavaScript, especially for those users who are heavier on the JavaScript side, or more importantly, if you're even thinking about TypeScript, composition API works with TypeScript like naturally in terms of like annotating types and all that stuff. We don't have time to talk about this today, but there is a Vue 3 and TypeScript workshop. Let me re-say that. There's a Vue 3 and TypeScript workshop that just actually released recently. So if you want to check that out to learn more about how that might work together, you can totally check that out. So, but there you go. This is how you get a component to fully opt into composition API while not having to worry about any of the one of the things actually that you might be thinking though is that we had an async earlier, right, on our setup. But when you're in the script setup, basically Vue hoists and does all the async stuff for you, so that you don't have to manually assign it here. It'll automatically detect the async stuff and do what it needs to do. And so just like that, we now have a component that's fully opted into composition API, no options anywhere. The only thing I will add is, because this probably wouldn't be the most intuitive, is that let's say we wanted to add our base button inside of this layout. All we do is you do base button, we import it. Let me do this, base button. And believe it or not, just by importing it, you've already registered it. So I can come down in here now and just go base button like that. And you can see there's our base button. So a little bit of show and tell. Does anyone have any questions about what they've seen so far?
I have to imagine that in practice, this really forces you to make concise components, because it's going to be a mess if your component doesn't change.
And you bring up an excellent point. So as we can see here, right now the code is fairly short, easy to follow. But you can imagine it's very easy for a team to get carried away with this. And spaghetti code can become very problematic very quickly. Again, sorry. Again, one of the things I want to emphasize is that there are trade-offs when you go the options route versus the composition API route. And understanding those trade-offs are, if we think about it, are what make us experienced as engineers. And so knowing that, you just have to realize that composition API means there's flexibility and freedom. And so your team has to then design the conventions it's going to use in order to make sure that your code is still maintainable and readable. As much as options API was a little bit rigid as far as telling you where to put stuff, it did mean everyone knew where everything was at any point. And anyone could basically jump in. But here, this is just the beginning, because what we're going to do next, after you all practice doing this yourselves, is we're going to talk about how you can extract these into modules that can then be basically tossed around different components. So That's just a little bit of a preview. But in the meantime, here is your challenge for this section. Go ahead and, ooh, wait, take that back. Rewind on the recording. Haha. There is one more thing I need to cover before we cover the exercise. We've done all this stuff regarding doing functionality, data computed, and we've talked about components. We did not talk about props. We did not talk about emits. So if you remember, if we look at our user card that I had earlier, we see that in the options, it's very easy. You just have a props, you have your emits, you just define it as you see fit. It's actually not that much harder when it comes to composition API. It's just, what do you think you need? You need a helper function. And so they are aptly named define prop, and they are define emits. These are the two helper methods that you need to know about. And so the way it works is basically if this Pokedex wanted to say take a region of props, a region of Kanto, for example, of like which region it was looking for, you would say define props is a function that takes an object where we can say the region is going to be of type string, and I can say like the default is going to be like Kanto, for example. As you can see, the syntax is actually very similar to what we learned already. The main difference being that one is being called by a function, but the second part, which is actually really important, is that if you wanted to actually use the prop in your computation, say for instance, inside of this computed, right? We wanted to actually say we want it to be uppercase and we want to add the prop to it too. How do we do that? Well, define props as it stands right here is just a function that's being initiated. What we need to do then, because it's vanilla JavaScript, is say const props. Or to be honest, you can name it whatever you want. It's JavaScript, but I would recommend just naming it props. Because then you can say props.region. And then when you do that, we can see at least, oh, it looks like the default is giving me some problems, so I'm going to ignore that for now. But we can see here, if I go to app.view, where is, oh, wrong app.view. App.view in the playground, give it a region of, let's just switch it up to Hoenn this time. There we go. I'll need to figure out what the default thing is later. But at the bare minimum, you can see that's how you define props. And then similarly, if you're doing emits, you basically const emits, define the emit. And then here, same thing, we can say change region, for example. And then everything still works exactly as we learned in this workshop. OK, so now that I've made sure to kind of at least review that, let me go ahead and commit that.
How in flux is this API?
Define props and define emits is.
I mean, the whole,
this
whole section you just showed.
Got it. OK, so the question here is around how stable the script setup is. It's fully stable at this point, production ready, ever since 3.2. So that's like the big caveat here. If you're using anything less than Vue 3.2, you won't have script setup. The compiler optimizations aren't there. But going forward, honestly, I have seen a lot of code bases. A lot of people just opt into this fully from the get-go. So yeah, consider it stable on that end. For things like define props, define emits, they're still playing around a little bit sometimes with how they can optimize the DX of, like, as we saw, default was acting a little bit funky. I'll have to look into that why. But those are things that are still kind of being refined. But if you can be guaranteed of anything, it's that Vue tried to do its best to be progressive about how it makes its changes so that as long as it's not marked as experimental, you can count on your stuff working in production. And then sure, we might introduce another syntax that would make it even easier for you, just like we saw with script setup. Because we got feedback on composition API, right? Like people liked it, kind of verbose, kind of, people had their feelings about it. And when we saw, I think, inspired by things like Svelte was doing with compiler optimizations, we said, why not? These are things that we can also do for our users. And so script setup, I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe was also inspired from what we saw with Svelte. Cool. So actually, we're not calling emits right now, so I'm just going to, actually, I can just make an example for people right in here. We could say emits. What does it emit? It emits the change region. That's your example right there. OK, cool. So I'm going to add this stuff, git commit feature, add script setup example in playground. Push origin 11 exercise. Great. All right. So now we can do this part. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to go ahead and refactor the users page that we've been working on. And this time you're going to use script setup to kind of trim down some of that code. And then if you have any props or emits you want to practice with, go ahead and do that. And otherwise, keep on moving stuff in, playing around, seeing how you feel. So I'm going to give this 10 minutes, and hopefully this should be an easier one to play around with. Great. Welcome back, everyone. How was the exercise? If anyone had any questions about how that went, please feel free to drop that inside of the chat. In the meantime, I'll go ahead and run through that solution. All right, so switching back to C'est la view. Then run dev. Great. Great. All right. So we don't need to see what's happening right now. So we're just going to actually just full screen this so that people can go all in as far as what's going on. So what are we doing here? We are going to go open up our users page. And let's see what we got. Well, everything's already been migrated in that everything is inside of async setup. So this is good. So let's start by adding that setup attribute. That's the first step to do. Once you do that, you'll realize, oh, OK, this is interesting. Now we got to start deleting some stuff. So let's start deleting that export because we don't need that anymore. Boom, gone. Well, we mentioned before that all components are automatically registered once they're imported. So that's gone too. So we can delete that. And then finally, we already said that the script should be set up. So we can delete this block too. And once we do that, you'll notice that the reactive, which was graying out earlier because it said it wasn't being used, it just basically detected the scope of the object and was like, I don't see it within the scope of the module. But you're fine now because we've deleted all those exports. If we save that, oh, we got one more bit actually. We can delete the return. And so now we can verify that everything is working. And just to make sure, we can just do a 1, 2, 3. There you go. Did update. Fantastic. Now, the only other thing, too, is that we just want to practice really quick using the define props and emits. The way that would work is let's go ahead and then say const props equals define props. And we could say something like title, for example, and type string. And then we can do a default of users. And so to show that this works, we'll come inside of here. And let's start by saying this is a test. So we test, great. And we can swap this out now for title. Title did not work. Why did that not work?
Import the define props, right?
Just refresh the page.
Let's see, hold up. Let me do that. Set, refresh. There we go.
Okay.
And so this was caught earlier during the exercise. In that earlier, when you saw me do the default and you were wondering why it wasn't working, for whatever reason, the hot module reloading just didn't catch that particular change. So once you do that refresh, it is showing up. Now, something was brought up, though, regarding, wait a second, how did you call define props without importing it? And more importantly, let me fix this part first. You'll notice that because we're not actually calling props anywhere, there's no actually need to do that. So you can actually just leave it off like this right now. But the question here around define props, why is it not yelling at us that we don't know where this is looking for? So the reason this is the case is because when you're inside of script setup, basically the compiler knows that these specific functions are going to exist. So in other words, define props and define emits, which I actually didn't clarify earlier, is only specific to script setup. If you try using define emits, define props inside of an options API, that'll just break. Because why would you? If you're in options API leveraging the setup, then you should already be using the other options. And so in other words, the compiler knows that it's technically already a global. So treat it like a global import for this. That said, though, I personally am typically a fan, especially if this is a newer code base, to just leave the import explicit. That way, no one new is like, wait, what's going on? There's no assumed knowledge here. We're good.
So why is reactive not like that?
Why is reactive not like that? So we delete that and save. The reason for that is because reactive cannot be assumed in this concept that in this context that it will be imported. So in other words, to think of it another way is that when this code is built and like compiled, define props basically just reverts back to its normal self. Like if it's not detected, it will get taken out basically. So there's some kind of optimization happening. I can't explain the details of it. But there's a reason why define props is OK, but then other helper methods like ref, reactive, view cannot intelligently guess those things. So as a result, it forces you to be very explicit that you want to use these helper methods. So yeah, they're called, I think, compiler-specific helper functions. But anyways. And then the other thing we got in practice is define emits. And that we can just say, once again, we can say like something like update user list. And so you can imagine how would that work if a user clicked a button that update user list, it would send it to the parent. Maybe it has to send some new data down. That's how that basically might be working. Cool. I did have a note here. Actually, I did want to cover real quick, I believe. Go scroll. Okay. Okay, nope, I think we're good. Oh, that's the thing. In the event anyone here is coming from Vue 2, and if you're using Viter as your VS Code extension, just a reminder to go ahead and basically disable and install that when you're working on Vue 3 projects going forward, because Volar and Viter will basically collide. So just wanted to make that note. Cool. Any other questions about what we just did? Some more the refactor, really. Use script setup for user page. All right. Cool beans. All right. I'm going to jump back into the playground so I can demo some stuff. Oh, here we go. By the way, you see this? So this is just like a small, like, lets you know, define props as a compiler macro, no longer needs to be imported. Again, it's not really going to matter at the end of the day, because you see that it's not actually yelling at you inside of your code editor. But it is trying to let you know that it is technically a global import. OK, cool. So to context switch recording-wise, make sure this is good, that's good. And then here is the slide to indicate where we're cutting. OK. All right. So we've talked about composition API. We've talked about script setup. Now we need to talk about something called composables. This is the new kid on the block when it comes to Vue, because it's basically a Vue-specific terminology around a type of reusable JavaScript utility that uses the composition API, hence why it's called composable. And so for those coming from a React background, you might be familiar with like the React hooks where they prefix everything with use, like use mouse position, that kind of thing. That pattern has also carried over into Vue, in that we will basically, I'm going to be demoing this shortly, but we'll be able to create some helper, basically utility functions using the composition API, and then this is the elusive, how do we share some stuff between components without polluting and rewriting the same thing? Composables are your answer for that. All right, so inside of Pokédex, let's take a look at this. OK. So if we're taking a look at this, let's say, actually, you know what? No, I think the better use case in this particular scenario is the counter. OK, so let's load up the counter real quick. So I'm going to go inside of my app.vue, and this time we're going to practice this. I'm actually just going to import my base counter. And this is from base counter here. We're going to delete that. And then we're just going to render out our base counter, just like that. OK. So there you go. Also, script setup in the flesh right there. OK, we have the ability to increment. That's fine. But what if we wanted the ability to count in other places? This is basically like an encapsulated functionality that we don't want to. Oh, sorry. One sec. OK, rewinding that back. So when we're looking at this functionality, again, this is a simplistic example, but for the sake of understanding composables, imagine if we wanted the count to be managed from multiple places. In other words, at base counter, it's nice that it has it here. But what if we wanted the base, let's say, inside of user card? What if user card wanted the ability to also increment the count? At the moment, you'd have to duplicate that. It's kind of tricky. You would have to probably do some props to have your app manage that. But count is something that really, if we think about it, it really does belong in base counter as a state. And it really doesn't make sense to put it at the app level, because the app usually cares about a bunch of other things. So what do we have? We have composables. How does that work? Well, let's start by creating a folder called composables, which is what you'll see a lot in code bases these days for Vue 3. And what we're going to do is we're going to create inside of that composables, I'm going to create something called a count. I'll just call it a count store, because that's what I wanted to do. I want to basically store what's going on with count. So I'll split this over with 2 columns so you can see what's going on. And so here, what we really want to do is we want this piece of data. Let's start simple. Let's make that shared so that we can show that in multiple places. The way you do that is we're going to import a ref. Well, actually, no. We're going to reverse engineer that a little bit easier. For those who are new to JavaScript modules, this might seem a little bit intimidating, but we're going to basically build it up from scratch. When you have a JavaScript file that you want to import into another file, the main thing you need to do is have something to export, right? So normally you would have an export like count of 10, like this. Okay? Actually, so let's make it 100, like this. And then what we could do is we could then say import count store, or actually import, we'll destructure this part, from composable/count store. And what are we're taking out of that? We're taking the count out of this. And actually, let's make this new count so that visually it's easier for y'all to see what's going on here. And then what we can do here is inside of our setup method, we could say, yes, we're going to go ahead and say return new count. OK. So to show you what just happened here, we just wrote a standard JavaScript. What's going on? Failed to resolve import composables count store.
You got to back up one level.
Oh, back up one level. Yep, file name. That's it. Great call. And then to show that this works, we're going to render this on the page. h2 new count. You can see we successfully wrote a little piece of JavaScript that's now reused in 2 places. Now again, to prove that this works, again, let's continue proving this out, is that we will then import the same new count on user card. Similarly, we'll use the setup method in here. I'm not going to spend the time to convert everything right now, just to kind of make the process a little bit easier. But we're going to return new count here. And then we can actually then, as an h2, also do new count, like this. And to render that on the page, I'm just going to go ahead and import user card from user card.
Pause for tornado warning practice. 1 o'clock on the first Wednesday of the month.
Got it.
Give us a sec.
Apparently, we are having a tornado watch right now, so hang on a sec. I will rewind it back. Yes, there's not an actual.
Know to leave Minnesota on the first Wednesday of the month.
Just the missiles.
Yep.
That was good.
Yeah, whoever wants to check.
So as someone who's never been through a drill, typically does this mean like get in the basement, like?
Just the test and sirens.
They just
Oh,
test
just
the
a
sirens.
test.
Yeah, every first Wednesday of every month at 1 o'clock, they just test the sirens.
Okay.
They do in the winter even.
Yeah, some schools will take like a tornado awareness, month, and then on that day they'll do their actual drill. But
Got it. So the idea is that if it's not the first Wednesday of the month and you hear this,
yeah.
Go
Worst
to
case
safety.
scenario, a tornado comes on the first Wednesday. At
everyone's
1
like,
o'clock,
yeah, we're good.
and
It's
nobody
fine.
takes it seriously. Yeah.
We'll wipe out the entire city.
Is there like a secondary siren to tell you it's not a test?
Yeah.
It's the first Wednesday of the day?
Nope. So, yeah, we might hear a second one that's
That's
further
totally
away
fine.
or within earshot. So we'll give it a minute.
I know roughly where I got interrupted, so I can just rewind it back.
No, you'll
usually a
like
second round.
we'll hear a second one because there's like we're kind of between 2 sirens, like where we live, so we'll hear both of them. But I think we might be in the clear.
We'll find out when you start talking again.
Yeah, exactly. The moment I start talking is the moment the second one is going to come.
Yeah, what are we at time wise?
We are at an hour.
Okay, let's just do a quick,
Okay, we'll do a quick cut.
just like 1
Yeah,
minute.
you got it.